Tonight's presenter is Bill Shadid, W9MXQ, who knows an awful lot about antique radios, backgrounds, ins and outs, you name it. I mean, he knows the circuitry of inside these radios. His collection is vast, very impressive, and it all works, which just is amazing to me. Anyway, to talk about the TR5, Collins transceiver, Drake transceiver, excuse me, and letting no more time go for my rambling, here's Bill.
Is mic on? Okay. All right, real good. I'm Bill Shadid, W9MXQ. I'm the editor of the newsletter, but mostly I'm the writer of the Vintage Amateur Radio column, thanks to Tom Ruhlman, who put me up to this quite a few years ago. So anyway, tonight we're going to talk about the Drake TR5, but we got to get back to the other screen there. Okay, and there it is right there. Yep. Now say share down there, I suppose you probably. There we go. Okay, now we got it. All right. So anyway, tonight we're going to talk about the Drake TR5 transceiver. It's the last HF transceiver that Drake made. There were some other radios after that, which I'll talk about tonight. And there's an example of one right over there in the corner. Now, somebody already asked me if that's going to be in the auction tonight. It certainly can be in the auction, but you have to meet my minimum that goes to me. Then the rest of it can go to the scholarship fund. So talk about generous. Okay. So I put that in there as a adjunct there. So we're going to talk about the radio now. All right, there's a picture of the radio in operation, and that is the one that's back there on the table in the corner by the stereo there. It's shown with a matching MS7 speaker. Can you see, Fred? Am I in your way? Let me get somewhere where I'm not bothering everybody there. All right. Pat, you okay? All right, so that's the last production Drake transceiver from the 1980s. All right, and to give you an idea, more of you have probably seen the TR7 than the TR5. Well, this is the two of them sitting together. You can see that the case sizes are identical. The TR5 is on the bottom. The TR7 is on the top. I'm sorry, TR5 is on the top. TR7 is on the bottom. You can tell that Drake did a pretty good job of reusing some extrusions and things like that, although the front panel layout is different in a lot of ways. So I just call that picture the common and the uncommon. All right, so the TR5 is perhaps one of the rarest of the rare today. It appears that the less than 500 of these were actually made, but because of an accident, when they quit making the radios, they sold a bunch of them to Amateur Electronic Supply. Amateur Electronic had also helped out Drake when they quit making the TR7 sometime later, and then they sold them at kind of a fire sale price. That never happened with the TR5 because several hundred of them were destroyed. I don't understand all the circumstances of that accident. I don't know whether they were burned because there's not any preponderance of spare parts for the radio. In fact, there's none. You have to destroy another radio to get a spare part for a TR5. So it's my opinion that Drake made several marketing errors on the TR5. Some were kind of understandable and some were regrettable. But they also made some progress in the performance of the radio compared to the TR7. If you remember, the TR7 was kind of a next step thing in ham radio. They were the first ones to use, or the first popular price brand to use what's called up conversion, where the first IF was at 48 megahertz. Okay, so let's talk about the problems with the radio as we go through. As we said, they made several errors. The power input was designed at 150 watts PEP. Well, roughly at class AB1, 50 to 60% efficiency. So the radio put out 60 to 80 watts, depending on what band you were on. Hams are kind of strange about that, because I can remember when the first ICOM 756 Pro came out, major step for ICOM. They moved into IFDSP, a bunch of other things. but the radio put out something between 95 and 100 watts, but not 100 watts. And this, every reflector or anything talked about that, about what a mistake they'd made. Well, you can imagine if it puts out 60 to 80 watts of what they talked about. Okay, and also the dial turned backwards. Now, if you've ever had a TR4, any of you ever had one of those? I mean, I think they were pretty popular. All right, it turned backwards, but it wasn't digital readout, so you didn't really notice it. The mechanical readout was there. It moved the same way that your knob moved, and you never noticed it. But on the Drake TR5, you would turn the knob to the left, and the digital readout would go up. So that was just a real inconvenience. And it's irritating. It really is when you use it. And it had no general coverage receive, which other than Ten-Tech at the time, nobody made radios without general coverage at that time. So hams got used to the fact that they wanted to listen to the WWV or the BBC or whatever, or their local AM radio stations, they could. But there were also some positives. Again, they switched from the 48 megahertz IF and the TR7 to a 5645 kilohertz IF. Now, today, that's up conversion receivers out there, transceivers, but we know how to do that now. Back then, that was major science, and radios like the FT2000 from Yaesu had a 72 megahertz IF. That's where the roofing filters were, and they didn't work. A roofing filter that was supposed to be 3 kilohertz ended up being 6, and things like that. It wasn't just Yaesu. They were the first to do that. ICOM had some problems on that, so did Kenwood. That wouldn't be a case today, but it was then. There was a better intra-radio wiring setup. Drake used in the TR7 something we call mother and daughter board construction. A lot of times I think of that as pretty modern, but it's not. There's a lot of connections there. Those connections get dirty. If you find a TR7 today that doesn't work and you clean every contact in it, there's a 95% chance in my mind that if you turn it on, it'll work. Okay, I put that up there. It's a little bit hard to see. Not necessary to really see everything in that, but there's a comparison of the TR4, the TR5, and the TR7. So you can see the lower power level. Let's say the power input on sideband, which is important. 150 watts versus 250 and 300 on the TR7 and the TR4. On CW, 150 watts on the TR5 versus 250 and 260 on the TR7 and the TR4. So these are major things. But a positive there is CW keying. I don't know if you can see this. Yeah, you can. They actually had QSK keying or full break-in on the TR5. Full break-in, it wouldn't be full break-in like on a Ten-Tech radio that you could see or some other brands or today's radios, but it was much better than the TR7 and the TR4. Let's see, what else are we going to bring up to you? Of course, the TR7 had general coverage. The others did not. If you notice down here, the receiver performance was roughly the same. The standard filters were similar, not identical. The TR4 was a little bit more restricted than the TR7 and the TR5. One smart move that Drake made is that they didn't use a non-standard filter. Drake was kind of like Yaesu. Every time they made a radio, they had a completely new set of filters. So if you had filters in one radio, they wouldn't fit in another model. Drake learned from that, and the filters in the TR5 are the same as the ones in the TR7. Okay, there's the 3 last introduced high-frequency radios from Drake. There's the TR5, there's the TR7, and there's the last of the TR4s, which, by the way, were made at the same time as the late TR7. So they were running tube radios and solid-state radios together. The TR4, the last one, had a CW filter that you could switch in, and it also had receiver incremental tuning, which those of you that had old TR4s, you didn't have that. You're absolutely stuck to the same frequency for receive and transmit. Oh, I didn't ask, that's right. Which 2 are identical, do you think? Most identical. Anybody know? Well, actually, it's the TR4 CW and the TR5. So we'll talk more about that. The TR5 bears little resemblance as an appearance to the TR7. Electrically, it's completely different. Okay, so here's the model order of introduction. There was the TR3 in 1963, the TR4 in 65, and really, I've never, as a collector, considered those radios any different from one or the other. They're both basically the same design. The really major difference between the TR3 and the TR4 is the TR3's finals ran on 12 volts, the TR4's finals ran on 6.3 volts. The TR6, which is numbered for the only band it covered, was 6 meters, then the TR7, then the TR5. So looks odd, but when you understand the whole story, it's not quite so odd because they didn't come out of order. Let me show you. Sometime in the mid-70s, Drake figured out that they were having a problem. The design was getting a little long in the tooth. The TR4 was being competed. The competition included radios like the TS520, Drake's or Yaesu's FT101. All these radios had receiver incremental tuning. They were solid state except for the finals. The TR4 was an all-tube radio. It drifted much more than those other radios. Things like that were getting a little difficult. The hybrid radios were all on the market. In fact, there were even some solid-state radios. Swan introduced solid-state radios long before we're talking about here. Drake did laboratory development at that time of a TR4 replacement they called the TR-5. Remember that dash, we'll talk about it again. That was a solid-state hybrid. That means, except for the driver in the finals. HF transceiver, then for an entry in the market, but they never did it. Nobody really seems to know why, but Bob Drake pulled out. He decided he didn't want to do it. Here's a picture of the only known prototype. It's owned or was owned by a fellow named Sundray Tarp, LA6, is it? Yeah, LA6 OP. There were some stories about that radio too, that whether Drake developed it or perhaps these guys. Anybody remember the Hallicrafters FPM 300? Another rare radio. That was at the end of the line for Hallicrafters. But there are some similarities between the radios, and as far as I can tell from what I've learned, the solid state layout and the tubes used were all the same. There was a thought that maybe Hallicrafters had tried to market that radio through Drake or convince Drake to take it over. We're talking about the Vietnam War times. Northrop Aviation, that owned Hallicrafters, was a lot more interested in military equipment than they were ham radios. It didn't happen, and I kind of think Bob Drake was a fanatic about reliability of the radios. He was terrified of having failures in the solid state amplifiers, things like that. That's what stopped the design of the that's what stopped the TR5 from being a solid state final. But we think that the bad reputation that the Hallicrafters FPM 300 had, and it did have a bad reputation, Drake shied away from it. And that may have been the reason that the original TR5 was delayed. Okay, well, anyway, we're into the late 70s. Drake is now suffering seriously from low-cost Asian radios. We had Kenwood and Yaesu on the market. ICOM hadn't come along by then. The TR5 was kind of like on the shelf. They designed it, but by then the TR7 had been developed, and Drake knew how to make a solid-state final. So we think of today's TR5, or the one that's in the corner over there, as a solid-state clone of the TR4 CWRIT, but not so. It is a solid-state upgrade of the original TR5 transceiver. So I don't know, we can say that the TR5 was a clone of the TR4, so it all gets kind of confusing, but just so you kind of know what was going on at the time. So what's the TR-5 and the TR5 about? It's a simple marketing deal. When Drake brought out the TR7, they left out the dash. Drake had their problems with that because I have Drake literature at the time that mentioned the TR7, the TR-7, all the things like the linear amplifier. Sometimes you'd see L7, sometimes you would see L-7. So Drake never got it straight themselves. But for the most part, radios TR7 and later didn't have a dash in the model numbers of the radio or the accessories. So some of these accessories you guys have seen. There's the L7 amplifier. I know a couple of us in the room, Bill there, you've got one, I've got one. Anybody else have an L7? Anybody have an L4B? Yeah, I think we both do there, Bill. I guess we need to go off in our own room here. The R7 and R7A receiver, anybody familiar with those? I've written articles on those two. I have one of each. They're a fantastic radio. They're based on the TR7 transceiver. The MN2700, MN7, and MN75 antenna tuners, speech processors, CW keyers. The main point I want to make here is that Drake had a complete line of equipment, just like the Japanese manufacturers do. I show a picture here of an RV5. Now that's a mock-up from WB4HFN Ron Baker, who's quite a well-known service technician for Drake equipment. But this truly is a mock-up. But Drake never did market that particular analog VFO for the TR5. We'll see a little bit about that a little bit further down here. Oh, also, Drake had the PS7 power supply, but they also made a lower cost, smaller capability power supply for the TR5, and that was called the PS75. I think, Bill, you and I have had discussions about that power supply on many occasions. I have a couple of them. And they were an example of a power supply made without a crowbar. So in other words, if something happened to the regulator, all of a sudden you'd have 30 volts on the radio. Drake's response to that was, oh, it's not a problem. The reliability of electronic components is such that it never happens anymore. I don't know that it ever did, but I put a crowbar circuit on my own. They did oddly have a crowbar circuit on the PS7, the fancier one. So let's go through all the transceivers that Drake made, the TR3, the early TR4. You can spot the early TR4 because there's no knob right there. On that one, there is a knob, and that's the switch for the noise blanker. I have a early TR4 that used to belong to Pat Volkman, W9JI. Pat, I don't think you put the knob in there, did you? Somebody before Pat. You notice this picture here, you see the little point right there? There's a little spot there where that knob goes, like you could drill a hole and put it in there. That's exactly where it went. Somebody did that on that radio. Now, I have replaced that with a replacement front panel that doesn't have the hole there. But in the early TR4, there was no way to add the plug-in noise blanker. The noise blanker in that one, and it is in this radio, had to be hand wired. And Drake sent that to the field that way. And I can't remember, there's dozens of connections you have to make. Open up lines in the radio and wire this in. Can you imagine marketing that today? So there was the TR3, early TR4, late TR4, no suffix, okay? Then there was a TR4C, and the difference with that radio is that the dial mechanism here matched the R4C and the T4XC. It was different. It didn't have this complicated separate band dial for each of the bands. Then there was the TR4CW, which everything was the same except it had an extra mode position for narrow CW. There was a 500 hertz filter that came with the radio. Then the last one took that radio and it added RIT. So let's look at that radio again. Those of you who had TR4s, the RIT version is different. It's got two extra buttons here, one for the noise blanker and one for RIT. There's that extra band position or mode position for the CW filter. And over here where the noise blanker switch was is the RIT control. Now, I have one of those. I don't know how many people, I don't think anybody else in the club has one of those. They are quite rare. There were about 1,000 of them made. There were 40 or 50,000 TR4s made, so quite a few radios, a low percentage of these. So let's look at the solid state radios. There was the TR7, the original up conversion design. There was the TR7A, which is basically the same radio, but again, Drake was having trouble with competition. So one of the ways they tried to stay in the ball game is they took all the options for the TR7 and made them standard in the A. There is no difference in the radio other than the options are already in it. And then the TR5. Okay, there's the inside of the TR5. That's the one again back there. The one you're seeing back there is got the front panel towards you, but this is the front panel in this picture here toward the top. You can see the power amplifiers over at the left side. I'll compare it with the TR7 in a minute. There's no mother and daughter boards. Those boards are bolted to a bulkhead, and then there are interconnection cables between the boards. Unlike the TR7, which had 3 optional filters, this one has 1 optional filter. And then the noise blanker is right here. That was optional. Okay, now there's the TR7. So you can see the power amplifier is the same. We're going to talk about that in just a second. There's the digital readout, which on the TR7 was massive. It took maybe close to just under a third of the available board area. This actually is a little tiny board underneath that shield. Digital readouts tended, at least at that time, to be rather electrically noisy, so they were shielded. I'm trying to think what else is the same. There's the bandpass filters. They're shielded in the TR5, not in the TR7. And there's the 2 filters in the TR5. The standard filter is this one right here. This particular TR5 has a 300 hertz CW filter. But you could get also 500, 1000, or 1800 hertz filters. One of my TR5s has a 1800 hertz, which would be used for narrow sideband. That's for listening, not for transmitting. Okay, and there's the NB5 noise blanker. Drake had problems with numbers all through their history. The noise blanker in this radio was called the NB5. They made a receiver called the SPR4, and its noise blanker was the 5-NB. So just to make it tough, I've known collectors who found TR5s, told me, I found a noise blanker on eBay, which is almost impossible. Well, it turned out to be this one. So that's mounted to a bulkhead that is between the power amplifier and the body of the radio. Well, let's talk about that power amplifier for a minute. Many Drake TR5s are misused because they turn the power up. You can get the power to go to as much as 300 watts. I think that's irresponsible on Drake's part. They would allow that to happen. But even though the casting for the amplifier and everything in appearance appeared to be the same power amplifier as the TR7, the transistors were nowhere near capable of the 250 watts input in the TR7. So people would burn that power amplifier out. That's a problem today because the TR7 transistors are no longer available. I mean, there's pieces around, but they're no longer made. And even more so, the transistors in the TR5 are not available. So if you're a collector like me, you run the radio conservatively, both of them. Okay, anything else here that you need to see? I think that's about it on that one. Okay, there's a picture, although the resolution is not too good. The meter is switchable ALC, the noise blanker switch, the Vox on and off, the speaker on and off, which is real handy, and the bandwidth aux means the second filter. Those were slide switches. Drake had this habit of using slide switches, and they don't last very well. This radio was a little different in that it appeared to be a rocker switch, but if you take the radio apart, the rocker merely moved the slide switch forward and back. It wasn't really a rocker switch at all. One of the nice things about this radio, and again, it played to its better CW heritage, is the AGC could be turned off. In the case of the TR7, you had fast and slow AGC, and that was it. On this one, you have fast, slow, and medium, and off. CW operators tend to want to turn the audio gain up, the RF gain down, and not use the AGC. So that worked, but it didn't work on other radios. Now, I'm always razzing my friend Bill back there because Bill, we get on the meetings and you're on Zoom and you've got your TR7 sitting there, just like I do sometimes, and you have a CW key out there. And I know you don't operate CW. You won't tell anybody else that. But you know what it is? Hams today usually have a Morse code key so they can tune up the amplifier. There's no way to get a carrier out of the radio unless you close the key. Well, Drake figured that out. And in the mode, they've got lower sideband, upper sideband, CW, and lock key. Mighty handy. So, Bill, if you had a TR5, you wouldn't have to have that key out. Now, Bill's not alone. I'm just picking on him, okay? And I think that's what we use each other for in most meetings, picking on one or the other, right? So, anyway. So let's see, we talked about the lock key. One other thing about the radio, unlike the TR7, you had to buy crystals to get on the bands that weren't covered standard. It did not come with 160. It did not come with 18 megahertz, 17 meters. It didn't come with 12 meters and only came with 28.5 position on 10 meters, which is a real problem on vintage radios because when they were made, the phone part of 10 meters was 28.5 to 29. After the technicians got 28.3 to 28.5, that's where everybody is now. So an old radio like this won't work on that part of the band. And now in recent times, it's tough to get crystals. There's a couple of companies, neither one of which are in the United States, that make crystals. But well, it's probably about $70, $80 by the time you get them here from the UK. All right. That's just a picture of the back of the radio. There's a cover here, and that's the case of this one. It does not have the optional fan here. All the connectors are the same as they would be on the TR7, but you can see here that the radio had the ability to work with an external receiver. It had the ability to provide an external receiver antenna, not the same antenna you're transmitting on. It had external mute, which would control the external receiver if you had it. So a lot of features that were more than what you'd expect on an entry-level radio. Just to let you know here about some of the ways things were put together, there is, I don't know that it's that one. There's the serial plate on a TR5. And you see that's an aluminum label, stick-on label. This is out of the manual, and this is a prototype unit. So they didn't have that on there. So those, if the prototypes were sold, they were covered up with a label like that. The serial numbers always started with 1,000 and they went to 1,500. But the thought is that they really started at 1,100, not 1,000. So there's either 400 or there's 500 that were made. A couple of hundred were lost. Okay. Oh, by the way, right here is that unmade VFO. You plug in the RV5 or the RV75. The RV5 was never made and they never changed the silkscreen. Okay, there's the two power supplies. The big one for the TR7, which would work with the TR5, peaked at 30 amps, was able to run all day at 25. It also had a 1 amp accessory line. So that would power things like the CW key or the speech processor, things like that. The PS75 also had that same accessory line, but it was good at running 15 amps with a peak of 25. And as I mentioned in my conversation, I added a overvoltage protection to my PS75. Okay, there's some other examples of accessories. One of the major accessories, two of them, I should say, was the L75 linear amplifier, which unlike the other amplifiers from Drake, which always were two 500Zs or three 400Zs initially, and a separate power supply, 2,000 watts PEP input. This amplifier had the power supply built in and at a single 3500Z, and it ran 1,200 watts input. So about 600 watts out, maybe a little bit more. And there's that digital VFO, the RV75. That's an amazing VFO. You can turn the radio on from scratch and it just doesn't move. But it was a good step for Drake to do, but it's all discrete. There's there's several dozen, several hundred, maybe even integrated circuits, layer after layer of boards, which today would be some sort of large scale integration, wouldn't be nearly that complicated. There's a setup of my TR5 components. You can see that oddball electronic keyer right there. Who is that? Gary, can you give me information on that? That is is that the XT4 or the XT4 Mark II? Or how did you name the, pardon? I know it. Anyway, I use that keyer with that radio. Works very well. No, that wasn't a Drake product. That was a unified microsystem. He never bought into that system. You know, that's a good thought. I don't know. We need to talk about that. You can do a program on that next month, unless there's somebody scheduled. I just wanted to mention a little plug for Unified Microsystems by our fellow member W9XT. I use his keyers, but I got a couple of your keyers. There's a really unique product right there. That's a remote control for the fan that's in the room there. Okay, this is an experiment I've been working on. My friends, I have several friends from Drake, work there, and we keep in contact. Because if you'll notice, you go back to my articles, there's a lot of them on Drake products. It's not documented that the R7 and the TR5 will work together, but they do. They work perfectly. And as I said here, I think the transceiving may be possible, but it's a real hassle because when I did this presentation, I hadn't tried it. I have now, and it will work. So the TR5 will transceive off the Drake R7 and R7A. As it stands in this setup, they will do dual receive. They will both sit there and receive. The problem is that the readout is wrong because it's going the wrong direction on the R7. So it's just confusing as hell. You need to know exactly where you are, or the guy we saw a presentation on last night, Riley Hollingsworth, will be sending you a letter because you don't really know where you are. Okay. So there's a better front panel picture. However, that's not the same radio. I don't know if you can see this. The guy I got it from and I know of 3 radios that were prototypes from Drake and added extra features, like is it going to be a TR5A? And we don't know, and we're never going to know, okay? But this radio takes the QSK, or break-in CW, to a new level. It's phenomenal on this one. It also has a thermostatically controlled fan. The fans on the TR7 and the TR5 tend to be a bit noisy. They're AC fans, for one thing. That's a little more noisy than a DC fan. But this one goes off when it doesn't need to be running, and it doesn't run necessarily when you transmit. It just runs when the temperature requires it. I don't know if you can, if you watch the pictures enough, can you tell what's different about that front panel? There isn't on any of them. That's a good point though, Bill. By the time they got to the TR5, Drake gave up on including an analog readout, like right there. And the reason that the TR7 had one is the initial TR7s did not come with a digital readout. That was an option. I don't know that there were more than a couple hundred of those ever made. And it used to be when you saw the term TR7, the dealer would call it a TR7 DR7 / and that meant that the digital readout was already in it. Pretty soon they dropped that and they didn't offer it without the readout. But the readout is not necessary. I have 2 TR7s currently, and neither one of them is the analog dial calibrated properly. I just let it go. Okay, any other comments on the difference? You probably didn't see it. If you look here, that's the radio that was in the previous page. You notice that the knobs are smaller there. Now, only guys like me notice knobs, okay? But anyway, they're different. Also, that knob's different, but I think that was an accident. There's whoever did this, there's the information on the back, the added components. It did have a place for a foot switch, which is handy. That was not easy to do on the regular TR5. And there was a way to inhibit the relay for QSK so it didn't click when you're keying. Just various things. The other one, we know we have access to 2 of the 3. The other one is exactly like this, except those extra components are silkscreen. So Drake went a little bit further. So was the TR5 really the last Drake HF radio? Actually, no, but kind of. So what was after? Well, Drake did make, any of you familiar with the R8 receiver from Drake? Okay, they were around. They really were sold to the shortwave listener market, but they definitely were ham radio quality. Most shortwave listener radios aren't up to the standards of a ham radio receiver. This one was. The R8A and B added computer control that wasn't in the R8. Otherwise, they're the same. They made an SW8 low-cost version of the R8. They also made a TR720. Any of you ever heard of that radio? That was a FM. There is a picture of it right there. It was an FM radio on 2 meters, had tone and everything, and it would listen on 440. Now, I don't know where they ever got that idea. Even by then, 440 was getting popular, but I don't think they sold very many of them. You hardly ever see one anymore. It's hard to even find a picture of one. Okay, but prototype never built, and I've written articles on these last few units here. There was a TR7B that got rid of that goofy digital readout, although it looked the same, but the circuitry was different. There actually was a TR8, which got rid of a lot of the problems with up conversion, and one prototype still exists of both of those. There was an L85 linear amplifier, which was a repackaged version of the L75 I showed you, and it was shown to major dealers. But Drake's price was too high, so they never made it because the dealers wouldn't buy it. There was also something called a T8 reciter. Now, those of you, beyond discussions that Bill Schnell and I have had, any of you know about the T4 reciter? Okay, Drake made the twins. Remember, they made the R4 and the T4X? There was a T4, no X. The X meant there was a VFO in the box. So Drake made a transmitter that you could plug into the back of the R4 receiver, and it would transceive off of what the receiver said. Drake prototyped a T8 that would plug into the R8. To my knowledge, that was never gone beyond a lab prototype. I have pictures of it, but it's just a big mess of wires and boxes and things you wouldn't really want. Well, I wouldn't want one in my station, but maybe the rest of you wouldn't, okay? Okay, I just wanted to plug the Drake Technical Net. Bill's checked in before, so he knows about it. Drake Technical Net is Sundays at 3 p.m. No matter whether we're on daylight time or not, it's always at 3 p.m. on 7238. The rotating net controls are Mark Gilger, WB0IQK, Doug Ward, W9DCQ, who's over in Madison, Evan Rolick, who's out in Ohio, Ron Baker, WB4HFN in Tennessee, and me, W9MXQ in Wisconsin. In fact, this week I am net control. We also have a technical expert, Jeff Cavelli, WA8SAJ. Jeff used to be the service manager, and I think for a while managed the AES store in Cleveland. And he knows all the AES people here. So like old home week when we all get together to talk. So you can get on the www.wb4hfn.com. When you get to that, you'll see a section for Drake and a section for Kenwood hybrid radios. Click on the one for Drake. You can find everything from old manuals to a serial number index, so you know when the Drake you have roughly has been made. Okay, questions? Bill. Yes, the difference, I was talking to somebody, maybe, I can't remember who I was talking to about the case on that TR5. You've got a TR7. Look at the case. The only difference is that on the TR5, the speaker's on the bottom.
Okay,
So the slots for the speaker aren't on that cabinet.
yeah, and when you showed the picture of the two side by side, I
Yeah,
didn't see the speaker inside of one.
so that's right. Oh, now I can hear you.
I'm done.
Actually, Bill, you've got a TR7, so you know what I'm talking about here. The TR7 is not easy to listen to with its internal speaker.
No,
The TR5, if you put riser feet on it, it's great. Okay, anything else? Well, there's a radio for you to look at there. It is for sale. My starting price for that goes to me is, what did I tell you, Bill? $6.99, $7.99. Okay, and the rest of it, if you pay that, the rest of it goes right to the scholarship fund. Yes, they are, and they sold for $400 or $500. This one has, if you look at it, the case isn't perfect. This is the way to do it. Actually, I think, I can't remember who I was telling, somebody tonight, that there's only 300 of these really known to exist, and I own 3 of them. So I can say that I own 1% of the manufacturing output of that radio. So take a look at the radio. It's an interesting piece. One of the things it shows is the lack of complicated stuff on American radios. That's not that way anymore. If you buy an Elecraft or a Flex or whatever, they're just as complicated as the Japanese radios. But at that time, they weren't. No, can't. I won't let you look in there. I'd have to kill you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.